Hello and good afternoon and welcome to this GED webinar after the summer break. I hope everybody of you had a good vacation, and so now we are back with our webinar series. My name is Uli Schof, and next to me is my colleague Christian Bluth, who is our expert for Europe and Central Asia, and who will also give you a first short input today and maybe some information for the participants who are visiting us the first time and do not know the webinar series we are having here from the GED project. First of all, I hope everybody can hear me clearly. First of all, regarding our timing today, we will try to compress everything as always into 30 minutes, so keep it really short and concise for you. We will start with a 5-minute input by my colleague Christian, who will brief you on the key insight of our recent study on the topic. Afterwards, we will have 2 short inputs and statements of our today's distinguished experts, followed by a Q&A. And today we have the privilege to host 2 distinguished and highly experienced speakers. The first one is Danila Bochkarev, a senior fellow in the East-West Institute. And at the Institute, he is a member of the Economic Security Department and works in the Regional Security Initiative team. He is the author of a number of academic publications and policy papers, and regularly contributes also to international media and policy debates on the European Union, Russian, and Eurasian energy, security, and foreign policy. So very good to have you with us. And we have also Julius von Freitag-Loringhofen here, who is project director, Russia and Central Asia, of the Friedrich Naumann Stiftung. He's an expert on EU-Russia relations. He has worked with BP as government affairs advisor and with G+, which is a public affairs consultancy based in Brussels. So welcome to this session. Before I start, maybe some information. Again, this session is recorded and will be uploaded afterwards on our website and also be available on our YouTube channel, so everybody who missed maybe the session can have a look at it once again. With regard to the interaction, for those who do not know, it's please remember that you can interact with us at any time by writing into the chat field for questions on your right in the panel. And after all the inputs, we will then go through all the questions successively, so nothing gets lost. You can write in at any time, and no worries. So, okay, let's get started then, and I hand over to my colleague Christian. Christian, the floor is yours.
Very much. What I would like to do is to give you a quick introduction into the rationale of our study and on the main economic results. Our 2 guest speakers will then more focus on the political rationale of such a free trade area. When Vladimir Putin visited Berlin on one of his first state visits in 2001, he launched the idea of a free trade area between Lisbon and Vladivostok. As we very well know, no concrete steps have happened, but recently German policymakers, including the German Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Chancellor, have said that they could imagine not only a lifting of sanctions, but even further economic integration between the EU and the Eurasian region, if this is an incentive for Moscow to play a more constructive role in the Minsk peace process. So let me show you what we have actually done. Is available in 2 forms of publications. The first, which you see on the left, is the full study, which is only available in German, as it was quite a lengthy publication, and it goes into much detail that for most people is probably not indispensable. For everyone else, there is the focus paper, which is available in German, in English, and in Russian, and which summarizes the main facts and which also provides a quick overview of the political rationale of such a free trade area. As you can see, there in this map you have the different trading areas, the trading blocks. In dark blue you have the EU countries, and those that have a little bit of green in them are countries that belong to the Eurasian Economic Union. The interesting area mostly here is the border area, because there's some countries that have entered a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, a DCFTA, with the European Union. And being a member of this privileged partnership program is incompatible, it's mutually exclusive with being a member of the Eurasian Economic Union. And this has caused some problems in the past. The most prominent is the case of Ukraine, which used to be a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, and after entering, after negotiating a DCFTA, and then the then government decided not to sign it, this sparked the public uproar that led to the Orange Revolution, and subsequently to the difficult relationships that we presently have between Russia and the Ukraine. Armenia is a similar story. Also there is a readily negotiated DCFTA, which the government in the end decided not to implement. A logic of a combined free trade area of both trading blocs would be to just permit this kind of conflict, of escalating situations, by just having one large area to which everyone could belong, and which would help to overcome the problem of mutual exclusivity which presently exists. Let me come to the effects of an EUEU FTA. Of course, there would be higher trade, and there would be subsequent welfare gains. There would also be less confrontation, as I've just described, because the more exchange between the two blocs would lead, as trade normally does, to a better mutual understanding, and it would actually be a policy that permits trust building rather than creating a confrontational environment. And I've already mentioned the last point, that such a free trade agreement not only has advantages for all present EU and EU membership, but especially for those people who are close to the border of the two trading blocs and who would gain substantially from being able to overcome these borders. So what would the effects be? In fact, the effects that we have computed would be twofold. Of course, a free trade agreement would make trade much easier, and making trade easier would mean just a rise in volumes. This rise in volumes would then also entail welfare gains, which would be substantial. The study computes long-term effects, so the numbers I'm going to present is not something that is going to describe the transitional effects, but the long-term equilibrium that, say, 5 to 10 years after entering such a free trade agreement would be reached. The volume of the export of the Eurasian Economic Union countries under such a scenario would rise by the number of, it would rise by 93 million euros, and that is equivalent to 2% of the present total exports. Similarly, for the EU countries, exports would rise close to 94. So in absolute numbers, both trading blocs would gain almost similarly. But there is, of course, because of the different sizes of the economies, the relative effect would be much smaller. What is more interesting than actually the volume effect of trade is the effect it has on welfare and what it means for the income of every citizen. We have in our study computed different scenarios. And the most interesting one is, of course, the one of an ambitious trade scenario, where not only tariffs but also non-tariff barriers to trade would be reduced. Under such a scenario, in the Eurasian Economic Union, the GDP per capita would rise by as much as 157 euros per head, which is of course a substantial welfare gain. Also in the EU, on average, the GDP per capita would rise by still 88 euros, which is a substantial gain. What is more important is that these welfare gains tend to be largest close to where presently the border between the two trading blocs is. So in the EU, specifically the Baltic countries would gain, and in the area of the Eurasian Economic Union, it would be specifically Belarus, but also Russia and Armenia that stand to gain most. We have in an additional version of the study also included what the effects would be if not only the member countries of the Eurasian Economic Union would enter a free trade agreement with the EU, but also if other CIS countries were to be included. The result is that the effects would be much larger, and that in such a scenario the negative trade diversion effects, which would otherwise be created, are simply not happening. So it would all in all be the most welfare enhancing scenario if this were an ambitious trade agreement that included not only the EU and the EU but also other CIS countries. So far from my side, I think I hand the word back to Uli, and then we'll hear from our experts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christian, and thanks for this input from our study. And I would now like to invite Danila Bochkarev to give us an input. To give us a short input and a perspective from his side. Danilo, please, the floor is yours.
Everybody can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Christian. Very interesting presentation. Actually, I have some questions that I possibly ask you, and that was your methodology concerning the trade and GDP calculations. But what I find quite interesting, and I think it's actually right, and I think it will happen. It's about the point about the trans-border trade. I mean, it's obviously, in that case, the border regions, they always will be profiting from this. But I also would like to share some skepticism. Obviously, when Russian side was referring to this common space, they have more in mind politics and economics. Obviously, there is sort of perceived frustration what Russia is really not a part of decisive decision-making mechanisms. And that's is a way of being a part of bigger space. And also participating in the common decisions. But if we see on economics, it also depends which kind of specific agreements this common free trade area will have. Because if you see in terms of energy, I think the exports to the EU is already on the maximum. That's, for instance, a case. As you see, with natural limitations put by third energy package, which will limit, further increase of exports. There are other exports, let's say, they are either not present or are severely hit by anti-dumping procedures. We're thinking about aluminium or steel production, and we should see, for instance, whether it would be, these restrictions would be removed, because that, in that case, of course, that would have potentially even higher effect than it was underlined in the study. And last but not least, it's about the politics. It's about this eternal dilemma of egg and the chicken, because if you see what comes first, it's a base, and then you have a sort of political rapprochement, or political rapprochement has to be the first, and then we will see we will see this happening. It's an interesting idea, but I think in the present climate, it's a bit too early to say about this. Obviously, you also have to see, I mean, what happens now in Russian economy, which is hit by crisis, and I would say it's not mostly about sanctions, it's about the oil price and some structural problems as a low productivity, etc. And right now, okay, opening the market will definitely not be the most wise thing from this point of view. I mean, obviously, it can be considered, but what would be the positive side of it? Because right now, obviously, for EU producers, you see it's especially agriculture but also consumer goods. It's an interesting opportunity. They obviously of higher quality and can offer competitive prices. But apart from raw materials and energy, there's very few things which can be exported to Europe. I mean, so the gains here somehow uneven. But from political point of view, obviously, it's an interesting idea. But I'm not sure if, let's say, people in Brussels or in European capitals are ready for such a huge undertaking. Well, I mean, let's say this criticism said, I mean, let's say what I would like to underline, there are interesting things, I mean, let's say, which is, for instance, like we can start working on promoting some small sectoral cooperation in certain areas. I mean, that's, I mean, let's say, will help, I mean, to build a momentum, even in times of quite tough and difficult relationship, and go ahead with a larger project. I think that's all for a moment. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Danila. Actually, thanks a lot for this input as well. Actually, we have the problem, we have a certain problem because we have lost the connection to Julius, which probably then gives us some time maybe already to collect some questions before he might come back to us to give us his input. So far actually there are, I'm looking at the chat window, and so far we do not have so many questions. There's one I could already ask. This is a question to Christian. In the meantime, Christian, there's one question from one participant. What would be the sectoral effects of a free trade agreement, and which sectors would gain, which ones would lose? Christian.
Yes, of course the sectoral effects vary across countries, and the important thing is sort of to generally summarize them, that what the sectors that would gain most on the side of the EU are manufacturing and automotives, whereas on the side, and agriculture actually, which is a fairly important point. And on the side of the EU, the Eurasian Economic Union, the sectors that would gain most are anything that have to do with natural resources, but also to some extent the metallurgical industry. I think especially when we were talking about the welfare gains, one point from which a substantial welfare gain for the population in the Eurasian Economic Union countries came from is actually the increased agricultural exports from EU countries, which make products of the daily life available at better prices.
Thank you, Christian, and for this answer. We have another question, and this one is for Danila, and the question is, sectoral coordination does seem like a realistic early approach. Which sectors do you think would be best to begin with? Where would a convergence be easier? Where would it be more difficult? Danila.
Hello. Thanks for the question. Actually, what I think the most difficult one would be those which are hit by the anti-dumping sanctions. I mean, and it's the steel and aluminum sectors. If you see, it's not only like problem in relations between Russia and the EU, it's basically a global war between the old and emerging steel producers, and then obviously here China comes first and Russia, but Russia is also quite an important actor, and which actually is like competing quite successfully with a number of producers in Europe. So that's the most difficult. The easiest obviously would be energy. I mean, like it's traditional thing. There is already like history of cooperation. There is sort of drive in the electricity sector. It's almost accomplished. In the gas sector, there's a drive for reform. I mean, which is getting the market structures and market rules, I mean, in Russia and in the EU are quite close. I mean, so I would say energy first. I mean, and then potentially certain sectors of agricultural sector might be an interesting case, because if you see, Russia is the biggest exporter of grain, for instance, but it's a rather low quality grain, but high quality grain is being like imported from abroad. I mean, so in certain segments of agriculture, it is also quite an interesting possibility. So I would say energy and agriculture were easiest, and meteorological is the more difficult.
Still have some time, so that's really today we're really really in time. Danila, do you want to ask a question? Sorry.
Yeah, it's actually a question concerning the automotive industry, because that's a quite interesting case. Because if you see the actually barriers, like input barriers for the automotive industry, led to quite interesting cases where it's like there's a lot of actually Western and European cars are being produced in Russia. And how do you see this actually I mean, what would be effect on the industry of assembling the cars inside the country? I mean, so do you think this would be much less interesting, or direct imports from Europe would be more, I mean, let's say, prevalent than growing, how to say, growing tendency towards producing in Russia and other countries of Eurasian Economic Union?
Yes, that's a very interesting question, actually. Especially in the light that Russia in the recent years has adopted a very strong import substitution policy. Generally, I think what regards the Western cars being assembled or produced in Russia, of course it would be cheaper for those countries to ship their cars from their existing production facilities to Russia rather than setting up new production facilities there. But since, so in that area there would be a gain to be able to make cheaper products available to the Russian market. But of course that only applies for as long as car companies have not already built an assembly or production facility within Russia. I think once they have done that, it's not very interesting anymore to not use that facility. So that is something that the present import substitution strategy is reducing the benefits of a potential future free trade agreement. However, and that's my second point on this, there is still a case for it, because as we have seen in Latin America, where many countries have for many years conducted import substitution policies, and where they tried to substitute many of the goods that they would otherwise import by domestically produced ones, as Russia presently does as well, that has been much less effective. The products were of much poorer quality and of much higher prices, and this was generally considered an economic strategy that failed. So I think that Russia's present import substitution program is a policy that is, in its current design, likely to eventually fail. So maybe this is a reason why the subject of increased free trade might be back on the agenda in a couple of years.
Thanks, Christian. We have another question here to you both. It's how might other trade agreements that the EU has recently concluded or is in the process of negotiating, namely CETA or TTIP, if we will ever see it, that was my comment, affect the predictions of this study. Does the longer paper account for these, or does it, as a theoretical study, only consider a possible FTA in a vacuum? Christian.
Yeah, unfortunately, the only thing that I can say is that we do not have any calculations that would give us a precise effect what the impact of a TTIP or CETA would be. I mean, there might be if there is only, say, TTIP and no trade agreement between EU and the Eurasian Economic Union, then there might be some trade diversion effects which lead to negative economic consequences for the Eurasian Economic Union countries. But it's very hard, or it's something that we haven't attempted in the study to determine the effects of what would happen if they were both at the same time, and how such a vast integrated economic space that would in fact be created would work out.
Thanks a lot, Christian. Actually, I just looked at the attendee list, and unfortunately we seem to have really lost the connection to Julius, but actually we are at the end of our session already, so that leaves me again to give you some information about the topics of our next webinars, where we will also deal with two interesting topics. One is Europe and India, relaunch troubled relationship, where we have analyzed and calculated the potential impact of an FTA between the European Union and India. And another one will be on China's direct investments in Europe. So what are the opportunities and challenges of growing direct investments in Europe, and also particularly in major markets like Germany or France? And these are the upcoming topics for the next webinars. As there are no further questions coming in, I would like to wrap up, and thanks once again our distinguished experts. So Danila, thanks a lot for your contribution, and also Christian for your input. And yeah, and hope to see you all the next time in our next webinar. You get, of course, an invitation, and maybe there's something interesting in for you. So thanks a lot, and take care. Bye-bye.